Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm aware that we have quite a large number of participants in our audience today. So it might take a moment for everyone to establish their connection. While we are waiting for everyone to find their way onto the platform, I will read you a list of some of the different countries from which our audience today is drawn, at the risk of coming across a little bit like Eurovision. Albania, Argentina, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Bolivia, Brazil, Bulgaria, Canada, China, Cuba, England, France, Germany, Greece, Guatemala, India, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Lebanon, Mexico, Netherlands, New Zealand, Palestine, Peru, Philippines, Poland, Puerto Rico, Romania, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Scotland, Slovenia, Spain, Sri Lanka, Switzerland, Turkey, Venezuela, and the United States of America. If I've overlooked anyone, I apologize. Welcome to you all. We can say that the number and the diversity of countries represented by each one of you in our audience today is an eloquent testimony to the global reach of the Lacanian orientation of the new Lacanian school and the World Association of Psychoanalysis in the English-speaking world. So wherever you are, whether you are joining us for the first time today or have been accompanying us from the start of this journey through time and through the detours and contours of this wonderful seminar, we welcome you all, each and every one of you, to this final installment of the London Society's online reading of Lacan's Seminar 17, The Other Side of Psychoanalysis. The past 12 weeks have been an intense and unprecedented working experience for many of us in unprecedented and unpredictable times. You will recall that we were launched into this project by the onset of the pandemic and the suspension of our customary modes of working and living. At that point, it was very difficult to know what kind of future we were being precipitated into, whether the pandemic was going to involve a temporary suspension of our activities or the start of a whole new mode of being in the world. The wager of this seminar, precisely oriented upon this particular seminar of Lacan, has from the start been to provide a thread, a slender cord, along which to guide ourselves as we confront this uncertain new reality, even if only by counting off the knots along the way, one by one, week by week, as we have proceeded chapter by chapter through these last 3 months. As we arrive at the final installment of this series, which just happens to coincide with the lifting of most of the lockdown restrictions in England, I have to say that I myself find the prospect just about as uncertain, just about as illegible as it did when we first set out on this journey together. Far from feeling that we are at the end of something, we find ourselves inhabiting a world where new lockdowns are being imposed in locations as far apart as Melbourne, Barcelona, and Mexico City. And the United States of America continues to report record rises in new cases of infection on a daily basis. Each one of us in each country is in their own way facing an existence shaped by the incidence of this unforeseen intrusion into our bubbles of certainty and security. When I initially wrote to Éric Laurent to ask him if he would do us the honor of agreeing to close this series with us, I think I put the invitation in the form of a wager, betting on the future, betting on the Lacanian orientation, betting on the teaching of Lacan, not just to have something to say to us in these times, but also in speaking louder than ever, becoming more pressing and more contemporary than ever, as we seek to elaborate a position, a clinical position, a political, a subjective position, to confront the real at stake and the changes yet to come in a world that is rapidly reconfiguring itself around us as we speak. As a reference for our attempts to even formulate some of the questions we are faced with, there is of course no greater resource than the work of Lacan and the work of the contemporary Lacanian orientation elaborated by the readers of Lacan who still have so much to teach us today. It is thus a great privilege, as much as it is a pleasure, for me to be able to welcome on your behalf Éric Laurent to be our guide through the reading of today's final chapter of this seminar. I tried to imagine any one of you in our dispersed global audience who might have found their way to the work of Lacan, who would still need an introduction to the work of Éric Laurent. Given that I'm aware that our time is limited, and given that I am as eager as any of you are to hear what Éric Laurent has found to say to us about this key chapter, I will only say that Éric Laurent has probably devoted far more years than he himself cares to remember to working with Lacan, to the elaboration and the transmission of the teaching of Lacan. He has been Delegate General of the World Association of Psychoanalysis for 2 terms, between the years 2006 and 2010. He has published more articles and books translated into all the official languages of the World Association than would be possible to mention here. I will, however, take this opportunity to mention just 2 of them. One key reference is a book published 5 years ago already, entitled L'Envers de la Biopolitique, The Other Side of Biopolitics. Clearly, you will appreciate that when it comes to working on a seminar entitled The Other Side of Psychoanalysis, the contents of a work entitled The Other Side of Biopolitics becomes an intriguing prospect. I will just rapidly say from my own point of view that if there were going to be some kind of guiding text, some key reference text for a Lacanian politics today, I suspect it would look something like this. Lamentably, we do not yet have an English translation of this work, but I would urge all of you who read French or Spanish to seek it out for yourselves. And the other text that I also wanted to bring to your attention today is a text by Éric Laurent from almost 20 years ago, entitled Shame and Self-Hatred, which you will find in English translation in issue number 51 of Lacanian Inc., along with some other key texts in Lacanian politics today. This text, Shame and Self-Hatred, sets out from a reading of some of the key questions of precisely this last chapter of Lacan's Seminar 17, our chapter for today, in order to open up some of the paths of investigation that can be seen to culminate in The Other Side of Biopolitics and the other more recent texts that Éric Laurent continues to produce on the place of the Lacanian orientation in contemporary civilization. It is thus with great pleasure that we are able to hear what Éric Laurent has to say about this key chapter to us today. Éric, over to you.
Thank you, Roger, for this great presentation. Today, we have a limited time, so I will speak 45 minutes. Then we will listen to the comments of Gustavo and exchange afterwards with him and with the panel. In 45 minutes, I don't think I will be able to, let's say, to say all that I have been preparing, but I try to do my best. Before I start, I would like to thank the wonderful job that the translators did in a short time, Philip Drivers and Florencia Shanahan, who really helped in a remarkable way and facilitated our communication here. So, in this final chapter, all the threads that weave together the relations between science and truth, from which the very fabric of the seminar is made, come together in one final shimmering braid. With the writing of his 4 discourses, Lacan provides a logical rendering of Freud's civilization and his discontents, constructed around a guiding principle that has been in place since the first lesson of his seminar on the object of psychoanalysis. This lesson, published at the end of the Écrit under the title Science and Truth. It amounts to what Jacques Miller has called a paradigm shift with respect to the place of jouissance. I quote Jacques: "The elaboration of Lacan's 4 discourses correspond to the paradigm that I call discursive jouissance. I find this paradigm in seminar 16 and 17 and in Radiophonie. What Lacan called discourse is alienation and separation unified as one. This is the import of that phrase from The Other Side of Psychoanalysis, quote, of Lacan inside Jacques' quote, "There is a primitive relationship of knowledge to jouissance, which is to be understood as there is a primitive relationship of signifiers to jouissance." End of Jacques' quote. On the basis of this logic, Lacan draws the seminar to a close by enacting what he calls une action dans la culture, an action upon culture. In this last chapter, great figures are mentioned for having asserted the rights of truth within the civilization of science through their own action upon culture. The Dada movement, the subversive Jesuit Balthazar Gracian, whom Lacan elsewhere considered a greater moralist than Nietzsche, and whom he ultimately called a saint. We also come across Pascal, not without his wager, and Kant with his moral imperative. In a central way, Lacan relies on Hegel and his dialectic of master and slave, of the noble consciousness and the base consciousness, supposed to be at the origin of culture, but also of Heidegger and his hidden truth. All these references are subverted, rewritten, organized to finish on an unprecedented operation, an unprecedented fair or act of making, which opens up a new field for interpretation. But the unprecedented conclusion of the chapter returns and loops back to its start in a way that is evocative of the river run of Joyce and the seminar that Lacan devoted to him. So, it's true that the first sentence of the last chapter comes like a thunderbolt. What is this to die of shame doing here? Which introduces the signifier shame, immediately transformed into a sign. And what's more, qualified as, I quote, the one sign whose genealogy one can be certain of, namely, that it is descended from a signifier. End of the quote. What sense is sealed and concealed in this to die of shame? We are immediately brought to a halt on the slope of meaning of this signified of this shame. While the terms genealogy and descended from guide us rather to the antonym of shame, namely to the honor of nobility and its concern for the purity of its descent. In his course, The Disenchantment of Psychoanalysis, a course I took part in and at which I presented a commentary on Rameau's nephew, Jacques Miller devoted a lesson to put it into perspective, the shame that Lacan evokes. It refers to an honor that fell into decline in the bourgeois order and then evaporated in the contemporary surplus enjoyment promoted by capitalism. Contrary to honor, Lacan saw a will to jouissance at work in the impudence he encountered at Vincennes, meeting the students there, participating in the events, the aftermath of the events of May 68. This particular shamelessness, this particular impudence, to have an idea of the impudence at stake. Probably we could also refer to the film by Steve McQueen in 2011 called Shame, precisely a film in which no one in the film had the minimum affect of shame and just is caught by a will of enjoyment that goes beyond all barriers, incest, death, etc. Lacan approaches this impudence via the opposition between base consciousness and noble consciousness that Hegel puts forward in his phenomenology of spirit. This shamelessness is the triumph of base consciousness and the destiny of the noble consciousness who gets transformed in the historical process into base consciousness. Insofar as he establishes a direct link between the signifier shame and to die of shame, the sentence as such, which is not a signifier, the sentence signals something, makes sign, fait signe, for it implies that when Lacan considers shame, he does so in a way that dispenses with the signified. Something is passed by way of the sign to be deciphered that targets the real in play, the real that excludes meaning. This sign can be read and it seems to me that it must be read, as an extension and a reformulation of the quilting point that Lacan introduced in his first teaching. The quilting point fixed the relation between signified and the signifier, making the text readable beyond what was signified by each of the elements that made the sentences. Lacan took what became the canonical example of the quilting point from a Racine plays, Atalia, with this signifying formula, the fear of God, introduced by the high priest Joad, and that swept away the threats and fear of Abner, an officer of the queen usurper Atalia. Quote from Lacan: "The fear of God isn't a signifier that is found everywhere. To have replaced these innumerable fears by the fear of a unique being who has no other means of manifesting his power than through what is feared behind these innumerable fears is quite an accomplishment. To invent a thing like this, you have to be a poet or a prophet. And it's precisely insofar as this Joad is one of, to some extent, at least by the grace of Racine, that he can use, as he does, this major and primordial signifier. It's the signifier that dominates the thing, since as far as the meaning are concerned, they have completely changed. Through his analysis of the way in which Racine introduced this signifier, Lacan himself dramatically transformed the relations between the significations at play up to that point, and also the relations between the protagonists. His reading of Racine is anti-psychological. It is founded upon a pure effect of discourse. I quote Lacan: "One might recall the way in which I drew out in my analysis of Atalia opening scene what has remained established in my school under the term quilting point. The thrust of my analysis was not to go in search of folds of Abner's heart or Joad or even those of Racine, but to show the effects of discourse through which a resistant who knows his politics comes to hook a collaborator on the point of putting out of the game to the point of leading him to make his own big boss fall into the trap." Were we to analyze this scene as a musical score, we should see that it is the point at which the signified and the signifier are noted together, between the still floating mass of meanings that are actually circulating between these two characters and the text. It's due to this admirable text and not to the meaning that Atalia is not a piece of bourgeois theater. Thus, end of the quote. Thus, Lacan already considers that something other than the Saussurean atom of meaning was needed to link the signifier and its abundant, transignificant connotations together. But in the light of what he presents in Seminar 17, of a direct link between the signifier and the sign, the quilting point is no longer enough. Something else is needed. That's what occurs in the shame introduced from the start as homologous to the fear introduced in Atelier. After having established the case of a sign that descends from the signifier, Lacan again uses the language of heredity when he evokes a degeneration of the signifier and signals the failure of the subject representation for another signifier. I quote Lacan. Being towards death, that is, the visiting card by which a signifier represents a subject for another signifier. There he introduced being towards death, pointing out the fact that the alienation, the process of signifying alienation, says nothing about the subject's status as living or dead. Unlike the sign, which implicates someone living, I quote now a comment of Jacques on that. Let's hang up to this formula, which has the advantage of being explicitly by Lacan and which is itself derived from one by the philosopher and logician Charles Sanders Peirce. Peirce's formula gave a definition of the sign in the following terms. The signs represent something for someone. And Lacan modified it, but acknowledging his debt to it, in the following form. The signifier, unlike the sign, represents the subject for another signifier. It's a quote, Jacques in the Sixth Paradigm of Jouissance. End of the quote. In Seminar 17, Lacan considers that the S1, under which the subject is bound, dead, in order to represent himself on an S2, is a failure of the alienation to reach the port it set out for. Unlike the letter, which always arrives at its destination. The slash into the S, the mark of the signifier, refers to the necessity of inscribing a jouissance in the interval. The signifier represents a subject for another signifier. This relationship summarizes symbolic alienation. But Lacan discourses introduce, in some way, the notion that the signifier represents a jouissance for another signifier. That's a quote from Jacques. If shame disappears from the world, if honor cannot turn into its reverse. If nobody can say it in an acceptable way anymore, then what remains is this failure of subjective alienation, a life that continues without any sense that it would be worth living. What is seen in culture as the longing or the search for the meaning of existence is approached by Lacan in his discourses at the level of the living being and the jouissance that marks it, the shame of living. After pointing out the place of jouissance in the discourses, Lacan comes to the place of truth, according to the terms he proposed in chapter 4 of the seminar we are reading. The chapter 4 that Jacques named Truth, Sister of Jouissance. After having evoked the shadow of the Dada movement, beautiful insurrection against the damage of science and reason in the aftermath of the First World War, Lacan evokes the furrows of the aletosphere that will take you or will take care of you all. In an impossible sentence to translate, qui vous soyuz tout vif, condensing in this word Soyuz, the spacecraft, the Soviet spacecraft Soyuz, and the French expression, le mort saisit le vif, the dead seize the living. In a way to paraphrase this, we could say that without any regard for the living beings, the machine carve up space, impose their hold over living being on the planet. Let us compare this sentence of the furrows of the aletosphere with one from Littérateur, where Lacan evokes not the furrows of the sky, but those of the earth. These furrows of the Siberian rivers produced not by the waves, but by water. In Littérateur, he says, the streaming, the only trace to appear on what of Siberia forms the plain, a plain desolate of any vegetation but luminous shine. End of the quote. Lacan pointed out that the air route to Siberia had been newly opened since the Soviets became less suspicious of Western observers of their military stockpiles of nuclear warheads, what he calls a piling up of oxygen in his Littérateur. The same reference with the machine developing themselves beyond any living being taking into the account the living beings. Even more than those in the earth, the furrows in the sky testify to the indifference of science to the truth of the living being. They just catch them up in their nets. When Lacan spoke of this netting, the Soyuz. We didn't have the myriad of satellites that made up the American GPS system, and then the European Galileo system. And we are still waiting for the 42,000 satellites that Elon Musk wants for his Starlink network to provide broadband internet for the whole planet. Everything that lives in the sublunar world can now be geolocated with extreme precision, for better or for worse. When Lacan speaks about the capture of the living beings by science, this capture results in the fading of traditions, the silence of God, the relativity of morality. When he says it's a prise de honte, seized by shame, it's a prise de honte in the sense of its vacillation. That is why Lacan evokes the efforts of Pascal and his wager, and Kant with his moral, absolute imperative. Two attempts to bring about an ethics based on the postulates of science. Probability for Pascal and Newtonian physics for Kant. These men of truth and passion were not masters. They wanted to make the master hear what was a definition of life worth living, and that it deserved a new definition. That's why Lacan calls them valets, striking up a resonance in passing with the name Vatel. As philosophers, and not as masters, they had perceived the consequences of science for the discourse of the mind. For Lacan himself, it's not as a philosopher, but as a psychoanalyst that Lacan described the consequence of the reform of the university taking place at its time, which we still see the consequence today, with its pseudo-quantification of all forms of knowledge, its placing of everything that is taught on the same level by measuring its units of value, the debasing of academic dignity to a shallow commodification of what is presently referred to as the market of knowledge, or the knowledge market. Lacan approaches the truth of this reform that was taking place at that time via Hegel. He encourages his listener to reread Hegel on the dialectic of the advancement of base consciousness. Régalez-vous, he says, condensing, regale yourself with its antonym, because it's disgusting. Or sort yourself out with irony and re-Hegel yourselves. In this new world, everyone will have points, medals, and a title called masters, a master degree, while it is expressly in conception merely a degree that allows one to gain access to the labor market in a rather enslaved position. Lacan's paragraph that ends with "the milk of truth will put you to sleep" should be read with the writing of the discourse of the university in mind. In this discourse of the university, the place of truth is occupied by the master signifier, which can be read as follows: instead of the truth, there is an identification. Lacan thus leaves the path of truth and takes the path of the real by taking up the apologue of Balthazar Gracian, who, to reveal what truth hides, imagines one that, transparent to itself in the splendor of its evidence, give birth that truth and brings to light what is most intimately contained within her. The two heroes of his epic in the Criticon, I quote now Gracian, translated there. These two heroes were already at the entrance to a city open on all sides. You could see its open streets, wide and very straight, without turns of detours or crossing, and all an exit. The houses were made of crystal, with doors and windows wide open. There were no jealous traitors or camouflage coverings. Even the sky was cloud-free and serene, with no ambush mist, and the entire hemisphere was clear. But this contentment did not last long. Walking towards the main square, where the transparent citadel of the triumphant truth stood, they heard, before reaching it, immense cries, as if issuing from the throat of some giant. Beware the monster, flee the bogeyman, save yourselves, everyone, run. Truth has just given birth to the hideous, abhorrent, abominable son. He is coming, he comes, he flies. At this terrible clamor, everyone fled without waiting for anyone. Too bad for the stragglers. And who have believed it. Even Critilo, one of the heroes, carried away by this vulgar torrent, ran away like a rabbit. In the next, end of the quote from Gracian. In the next chapter, Critilo's companion, Andrinho, learned that the world is not transparent as the city of truth made believe. It's all encrypted. And he said, are all the truths encrypted? I repeat that yes, they are, from first to last. And anyone who doesn't already knows it, learn that the monster they fled at the end of the previous chapter is hatred, the eldest daughter of truth. In this apologue of Gracian, it's not truth, sister of jouissance, but truth, mother of jouissance. The apologue concludes with the link between truth and the real of the hatred. Lacan adds a clarification of his own invention that the treatment of the real by the university discourse is overshadowed by the production proper to it. the S bard, who is at the place of the production at the bottom right of this discourse of the university. This production can be read as disoriented subjects who have nothing to hold on but that identificatory medals. Then Lacan takes up the answer he gave in Radiophonie to the question about the incompatibility of truth and knowledge. The first part of his response is a fundamental de-idealization of truth as one and as origin. That's why he said one can piss or spit on the truth. To the idealization of truth at the place of origin, he opposes truth at the place of passage. And he recalls that within the psychoanalytic discourse, he has put, I quote Lacan, psychoanalysts on their guard by connoting this to which they have pledged their troth, their truth, through their knowledge as love. End of quote. It is the subject supposed to know that designates the place of the psychoanalyst, who has no vocation to incarnate truth. Truth introduces the lure of a whole, of an all. I quote Lacan, that one has everything to learn from truth. This commonplace destine each one to get lost in it. End of quote. To this commonplace truth, Lacan opposes the bit of truth. The bit of truth is what can be written of it. It gives another reading of the warning Lacan put in chapter 4 of our seminar, when he said in chapter 4, truth is not to be handled outside propositional logic, where it is made into a value, reduced to an inscription, to the handling of a symbol. This usage is most particularly bereft of hope. That is what's salubrious about it. End of quote. Nevertheless, put back in place, it is necessary to deal with this truth reduced as a bit of truth. And Lacan did so by distinguishing true psychoanalysis and false. That was the name of the conference he gave at the end of the 50s in Barcelona. But if he was able, Lacan, to restore the truth of psychoanalysis, it was with tact. I quote him in Seminar 17. I have obtained it, but it's through not giving the appearance of having laid a finger on it. End of quote. He then gives us an example of what he calls the appearance of not touching it, continuing in the extremely sustained tone of his speech. I've got 5 minutes, which is not usual in the radio or the mass media. Lacan, of course, knows that the answer he gave in Radiophonie just amazed the public. But for him, it confirms his choice or method. He said this is one of the methods by which it would be possible to take action within culture. So I get back to the conclusion, which is another action on culture. What it said, they take to touch the truth lightly. It also said you have to touch the effect of science lightly. He puts it simply, one mustn't tease the Latous too much. And for that, we must rely on this fragile being, the ethical status of the unconscious, the subject supposed to know. Oh. The status seems fragile, but what issues from it is useful and solid. Lacan calls the places of discourse and the letters that occupy them radical function. And he takes as a model, I quote, Galileo's initial step, the emergence of the integrals and differentials in Leibniz, and then the emergence of logarithm. Lacan gives an example of why he calls his letters functions. He uses the unary trait, the master signifier, to show that it allows him to use the expression discourse of the master without the imaginary staging of the Hegelian death struggle for pure prestige, with its consequence, which relates to knowledge, supposed to be on the side of the slave because the master abandons him to him. Lacan reduces all this myth to a function of discourse. I quote, there is only the necessity that something be produced that functions is knowledge as a master signifier. Just as the logarithm is a relation of relation, it's on the basis of knowledge itself and not from any natural experience that the relation known as master signifier is constructed. Lacan specified the necessity that produced the est-one. The necessity is the whole. I quote, the whole from which the master signifier arises. Then he introduced the function of S1, who defines the readability of discourse. Knowledge as such, and beyond that, any text is readable only through the master signifier. Lacan then takes two examples, the latest novel published by Balzac, The Other Side of Contemporary Life, where the master signifier is embodied by a woman, as the secret of the story, and the reading he had given 66 of Atalia. In his first teaching, Lacan produced these quilting points, but now he abandons a reference to the quilting points and talks about a wildfire that comes through all the discourse, and he speaks of hooking on. We are in the era of the flight of meaning. Lacan rereads himself and his quilting point. I quote him in Seminar 17. The quilting point was a way of asking them to notice how something that spread throughout language like wildfire is readable. That is to say, how it hooks on, how it creates a discourse. In Seminar 23, Lacan radicalizes his new approach with the knots. He says, my Borromean knot changes the sense of writing. It shows that there is something to which one can fasten signifier. How then does one fasten signifiers to it? It's through the intermediary of what I call dimension. That is, places of the function of language. So it seems that the notion of readability that Lacan introduced in this chapter is a more complex function than the quilting point, because it includes both the hole in the knowledge and the surging up of the master signifier. It includes the whole. Lacan made it the point of his intervention on university discourse. He underlined that the key to this discourse is the production of the thesis that allows you to make a name for yourself, the master name of a doctor. It gives you the weight of your name. I quote Lacan, you will forever have your thesis pinned on you. That is what plays the role of a master signifier. That's why Lacan, at that moment, precisely proposes to launch a journal in which unsigned things could be written. And Lacan himself underlines that he does not consider himself as an author. I quote him, I am in no way an author. Nobody even dreams of this when they read my écrit. End of the quote. Lacan contrasts the function of the author with that of serving this psychoanalytic discourse. The one can be close as possible, not the one, that function can be as close as possible as, I quote, calling knowledge into question. What sort of disaster does analytic knowledge produce? What one produces that is most consistent doesn't have an author, a name, a self, a life, a psychology. What's at stake is what makes it consists. The only consistency that counts is that of the discourse to which we apply ourselves. To conclude, Lacan gives the key to his introduction of shame as a nomination of the jouissance of the new sub-proletariat, the one constituted by the contemporary student, caught in the machine of producing value that constitute the university discourse and its machinery of rivalries and ranking between students themselves, between university, produces undergraduates in search of vanishing jobs amid the proliferation of what David Graeber of the LSE called bullshit jobs. It's a factory that produces shame of living. What is the meaning of the shame? Precisely, Lacan does without that meaning. He makes circulate his signifier of shame through all the texts that make up this last chapter. He makes it a sign that circulates beyond meaning. It is indeed the declination of shame at different moments in the demonstration about the master signifier that makes the relationship between knowledge and truth readable. It is thus shame that becomes a master signifier, just as the fear of God was in Atalia. Lacan literally realized what makes the last word in his lesson. À faire honte, he said. Make shame. Make you ashamed. This is both what makes a whole in the questioning of his student audience, and that which gives the key to a new way of conceiving the action of the analytic discourse and interpretation on the basis of a new signifier. That's it.
I thank Éric Laurent for this wonderful, careful reading that he has performed on our behalf of some of the more hidden contours, shall we say, of this last chapter, and some of the more subterranean threads that come to be knotted in this final chapter, running not just through Seminar 17 as a whole, if the seminar constitutes a whole, but through the trajectory of Lacan's teaching, taking us back to that notion of the quilting point in Seminar 3, reminding us that already at that stage, Lacan had this notion of monotheism linked to the establishment of the master signifier, all the way to this formulation of legibility, of readability as the new master signifier, leading us then again to Seminar 3 and the notion of knotting at stake in the Borromean knot, including this question of shame as a signifier that transformed immediately into a sign. As far as I follow, shame as a nomination of jouissance. So this reading has certainly provoked all kinds of questions in me, but I also know that we have Gustavo Dessal standing by in the role of today's designated discussant, designated precisely to bear the weight of questioning on our behalf. Gustavo is a psychoanalyst in Madrid. He's an analyst member of the Spanish school. He too has devoted a lifetime to clinical practice, to studying and teaching Lacan in many of the languages and many of the countries that make up the Lacanian community of the World Association of Psychoanalysis. He is the author of countless articles and clinical presentations, noted as much for their literary sensitivity as for their clinical subtlety. He is also a regular contributor, commentator to various platforms of contemporary media publications, more details about which you can find via his Facebook page. He also happens to be a writer of fiction. There are a number of collections of his short stories available in Spanish. I know he's an aficionado of genre, but these stories, we can say, would be of a genre that would be very difficult to specify, unless we could allow that there is such a thing, which he would have invented, such a thing as the psychoanalytic short story. I leave to you the question, in confrontation with his writings, in particular for our English readers, his clinical novel entitled Surviving Anne, which is available in English publication, which is not only a literary experience in its own right, but which also has many wonderful clinical insights to teach us. Anyone interested in access to the delimitations of some of the contours of clinical experience within a work of literature might be interested to seek out this work of clinical fiction and to treat yourself to the experience of Surviving Anne. But for today, I ask Gustavo to introduce some comments and questions that he might pose to Éric Laurent in relation to this final chapter and the shame of living. Gustavo?
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Very well, Gustavo, yes.
Firstly, I would like to say thanks to Roger for having invented this wonderful journey, this sort of series, and for being a charming host to all of us. Good morning, Éric. It's a real pleasure to see you. And I will focus on shame. Let me read some notes that have been inspired to me by this chapter and your reading. Shame was for Freud a dam against the direct satisfaction of the drive. It's a constitutive element of civilization, together with guilt, disgust, and compassion. Those dams depend on the name of the Father, so we are not surprised if in the present state of civilization they are broken, or at least severely cracked. To die of shame. Why couldn't we also say to die of disgust? It's an expression that would fit very well as regards politics. One dies of disgust before the political show when politics has lost the sense of shame. But this politics doesn't come out of the blue. It's one that has been voted by the citizen identified with the autonomous ego, the ego that asserts itself on the exaltation of freedom and unrestricted right to jouissance. The citizen identified with the autonomous ego has gone through a very bad time during this lockdown. The autonomous ego is the subject who doesn't feel indebted to any master signifier. And I think you say this in a very wonderful way. I have the privilege of possessing your text when you say that if shames disappear from the world, if honor cannot turn into its reverse, if nobody can say in an acceptable way anymore, then what remains is this failure of subjective alienation, a life that continues without any sense that would be worth living. So the autonomous ego is a subject who doesn't feel indebted to any master signifier. It believes It doesn't serve anyone at all and enjoys its right to enjoy. Thus, it rejects any kind of restrictions. We see this all around the world. It's the government's fault. The government is a master signifier that is refused by all means, no matter how false and unreal these means might be. The citizens identified with the autonomous ego, who doesn't blame their government, are the Americans and the Brazilians. Those two countries are ruled by two clowns. Clowns usually don't feel ashamed. They have made a profession out of exhibitionists. These two clowns in particular master their art to the extent of obscenity. They are very good examples of what the foreclosure of shame can be. The lack of a gaze that produces shame is not only verified in the obscenity of the contemporary world. We can also perceive it in the impudence of speech. Everybody is able to say anything because nothing has any consequence at all. So it's not difficult to understand that fake news are now simply the news, the usual style of information. The impudence of speech and the lack of that gaze make the division of the subject almost impossible. And in the rule of free association, the analysand is asked to speak beyond the limits of modesty. But the analyst's function is to try to produce the subject's division. This is the root of transference itself. Suddenly, I notice your presence, Lacan says about the way the analysand discovers the analyst in the transference. That presence, as in Sartre's apologue of the keyhole, reveals to the analysand his own condition of being an object. The autonomous ego doesn't experience itself as an object. It shows itself. It boasts about its autonomy and challenges shame. He is convinced that everything is allowed to him. Long time ago, they said, women and children first. This was replaced by another formula, my jouissance first. We have an outstanding example of this change in the world. During the pandemic, the mask has become a symbol. The mask is not only a sanitary measure, it's also a veil. Leaders and citizens with no shame feel very proud of not wearing this veil. That's the reason why bigots of the autonomous ego have turned their refusal to wear the mask into a symbol of their right to jouissance, their right not to be disturbed by any restrictions at all. Lacan made a very accurate observation. Modesty is imperceptive. The impudence of one subject is sufficient to become a violation of the other's modesty. So I introduce a question to you, Éric, but also open to all of you. Have we reached a state of civilization in which modesty is no longer imperceptive? Is it now possible that the exhibitionism of the other doesn't affect my sense of modesty? The psychoanalyst doesn't judge. That is what we call the rule of abstinence. He doesn't devote himself to produce guilt. However, at the end of this seminar, Lacan introduces shame. The psychoanalyst doesn't produce guilt, but maybe he should produce shame. If it is recommendable he acted this way, it's not because of a moral reason, but because of ethical ones. The analyst does not condemn jouissance, and he doesn't authorize or stimulate it either. He teaches the analysant to recognize himself in his object status, remainder of the discourse of the unconscious, and to be responsible for his position and for the consequences of his jouissance. In order to obtain this outcome, sometimes the analyst has to make his analysant feel a little bit ashamed. The other's gaze no longer works as a limit in the present world. Quite the opposite is not only a gaze that doesn't induce shame and therefore division, but it is a gaze that enjoys looking how the others enjoy. A good example is the fact that the authorities in charge of Auschwitz now have asked its visitors not to make selfies. The autonomous ego makes a selfie and uploads it on Instagram. I wonder, and I ask you, if it is in the aftermath of the Holocaust when that gaze of the other, the gaze that fulfilled the function of shame, began to vanish. I think, to conclude, that Lacan has been misunderstood by those who believe the psychoanalytic discourse neglects ideals. Psychoanalysis neither propels the idealization of jouissance, nor does it admit the fact that someone would authorize himself in his jouissance to justify his position as a subject. Freud's and Lacan's psychoanalysis is not the disdain towards ideals. It's the gaze that reveals what is hidden behind the ideals. But if Lacan evokes honor, bringing in the story of Vatel, it is because psychoanalysis does not align itself with the primum vivere, with life without nobility. That's why every once in a while the psychoanalyst has to produce a little bit of shame. That is to remind that there exists an ethics. Thank you so much, Éric, for your wonderful transit from the fear of God towards the shame instilled by Lacan.
Thank you, Gustavo, from this comment and from what you yourself developed. From the question you asked, I will start from, let's say, in your development, you stressed that the one who could die of shame rather are this new kind of populist politician who shows themselves freed from shame in a way that goes beyond let's say, the previous ethos of the politicians in representative democracies. These populist leaders you call clowns, yes, sometimes we wonder when they go beyond all limits why they cannot die of shame. What's surprising in Lacan's text is that he does not address the shamelessness of politicians. In his time, in 1969, he also had harsh words for the politicians who were in charge at that time, and who, with ruthlessness, determination, put back France, let's say, back into an order. He could have denounced them, but precisely not. It was not to the politician clown he talked to. It was to his audience, the students, the one who were rebels, the one who had made all this fuss the year previous, who wanted a new world order, a new way of living. And it's precisely to them that he wants to point out the necessity of not immersing themselves into this well of jouissance, but to keep the singularity each one is made of, to have his honor maintained. Transformed, let's say it's not the nobiliary honor he speaks about. Mm-hmm. But no doubt, it's one of his main, let's say, red thread that runs to the different versions of the ethics that Lacan wants to revive in the age of science. It's not to be reduced, the subject has not to be reduced to just a cipher or a common factor or a universal, but precisely to have the ethical necessity to play his own game with science and truth as they are and as they develop themselves, their contradictions in the world we live in. And why did Lacan did not denounce in this seminar the shamelessness of the masters? Along the seminar, I remind, he had harsh words for the masters. But precisely, he didn't denounce that because they were not in his audience. The one who asked him to come to Vincennes were the students. The public of his seminar was made of that generation. And precisely, it was because of the interest he had in them and because they asked something from him that he could interpret. The analyst depends on that. We can only interpret if something is addressed to us. Lacan called it, this address can be called on various names, a desire of reconnaissance, then through the drive. And at the end, even in the monologue of the subject of the par lettre, something is addressed to the other, even if it's the other that does not exist. We need this prerequisite. And Lacan needed that audience so he could produce a shame in which he gave a new meaning with precise linking it to the circulation of it throughout the various discourses. He makes the signifier circulate. That's the first way to answer your question, who has deep resonances. But I would stick for the moment to that answer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gustavo, for the question and the comments contained in your intervention, as much as for the response that they were able to elicit for us. I see that Florencia Shanahan might have a question that she wants to pose. Florencia?
Yes, thanks, Roger, and thank you, Éric, Laurent, and Gustavo, for your presentations. It's a question, but it's more a remark with regards to this point where Éric Laurent made the difference between being an author and serving the psychoanalytic discourse. And in a sense, with Gustavo's reading of this chapter, what was coming to me was formulating the question that lies at the heart of each demand addressed to an analyst, which is how to give a damn. And if it's not being the guardian of an established order, then the orientation that psychoanalysis offers is something else.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
How do we proceed, Roger? Should we take a certain number of questions or answering one by one?
We have one question on the chat, which I will read out to you for your consideration, and then you choose what you wish to respond to as best you can. And we take it as far as it's a question on the chat from Michelle Julien, who has a question about the term immonde, the unworld, taken from Seminar 21, where apparently there's the term the immonde in relation to the obscene as that which is squalid, where apparently Lacan poses the notion of shame as the last virtue. Seminar of 12th of March 1974 in Seminar 21. Is there room to introduce some comments about the obscene in relation to the question of shame as the last virtue?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we have any further questions from the There's a question from Vincent Dashi. Vincent?
Yes. It's a bit of a dry question, perhaps. Lacan introduces the four discourse as a structural apparatus, a structure. And I was wondering if later on he introduces the capitalist discourse in a way as a discourse that shouldn't exist according to the primary articulation of the structure, does that mean that the notion of structure vacillates a bit? And is that perhaps why the notion of shame is also introduced at the end, in a way as a direct allusion to the capitalist discourse?
We have, thank you, Vincent. We have one further question pending from Susanna Huller, and then maybe Éric, you'll just find your way, find a thread through the different questions, if you can. Susanna, if you unmute yourself.
My question is a question of a student to a teacher, I have to say. I wanted to take advantage of Éric Laurent being with us to help me to read a couple of lines. I will read it, it's from 183 in the chapter, and the lines say, being ashamed of not dying from this, from not being ashamed, would perhaps introduce another tone to it, that with which the real is concerned. I said the real and not the truth, for as I already explained to you last time, it's a temptation to suck the milk of truth, but it's toxic. It will put you to sleep, and that's all that is expected of you. I have the feeling that you can read for us this, because my question is, how do we know that the real is concerned there? I have to say that this is something I couldn't imagine. So, Éric, I would like your reading of these lines.
Fine. We could start from that.
Good.
And then weave our way through the other question, who each one has his crucial interest. But in these lines, at least we have a strong opposition between truth that makes you sleep and the real that wakes you up.
Yes.
It wakes you up to what? It wakes you up to the jouissance at stake. The jouissance goes beyond, let's say, the homeostatic process of the pleasure principle, who is, in ultimate instance, is due to the identification process. Like I said, in the lines have to be read with the writing of the university discourse, in which at the bottom right, the production, or at the bottom left, sorry, the place of truth is occupied by an identification, S1. So what he calls to suck the milk of truth is the kind of imaginary, or let's say, reference to the weaning process. But it's the place of truth, which has to be maintained, precisely void. If one occupies it with an identification, then you're caught in it. Caught in that identification. And the reference to jouissance wakes you up from all that comes with the functioning of the identification. if we see the writings of the discourse as a structure, like Vincent Dachy said, somewhere in the last chapter, Lacan says these discourses are not the tables of the history. It's not the Mendeleev tables of history. And himself gave precisely the wrong example when he writes the capitalist discourse, like Dachy said. It was precisely not a possibility of the circulation of the letters he has made. Precisely himself shows that all this has to be handled with tact, but not taking that as a, let's say, mathematical formula. It can be used with freedom, producing effects of discourse. And he showed the way. And so that's why when we use these discourses, it's very important not to lose the thread, not to be fascinated by the wonderful structures that can explain so well the functioning of the discourses, not to be fascinated by that, but do not lose the link that it's writing the logic of alienation and separation, the logic of the symbolic alienation and the jouissance separation from the other, written in the same discourse, and that has to be used in a way that goes beyond the rigidity of the structure. And at the end of his teaching, Lacan uses the knots as a kind of questioning of the structure. The opacity of the knots, the fact that a knot can be transformed in a way that it takes a lot of time to be sure of the structure of the knot. This opacity as such is a questioning of this structure as the symbolic order, no doubt. And in the ultimate teaching, he questioned the notion of symbolic order as such, rather saying that that kind of order can always be transformed, reorganized, re-displaced by the reals that are at stake. That's the main thing is the effects not of discourse, but the effects of jouissance. If we want to take the relationship between immonde and shame, first, let's say, to say that the world is made of a non-world. Le monde est fait d'immonde, like he said. It's exactly the same, let's say, it's another reading of what was written in this last chapter we read, when he said we have to start not from a natural experience of the world, but from the knowledge, from the experience of the knowledge in us. We have to start to have an idea of the world we live in. We don't have to start with the perception, but the effects of language on us, which introduces knowledge being, let's say, a short condensation of the effect of the other on us, which produces jouissance, but first produces wholes. in the body, who are articulated with the holes in the knowledge. So the world we live in is at the same time the world of nature, but added with all these knowledge and the mix between the holes within it and the master signifier who names jouissance, all this as a mix. We never have the world separated from the other as such. So in the world we live in the world in which the par-l'être lives, there is all these elements, this bout de réel, these signifiers isolated, these S1. All this is part of our world. And that's why it's a world in which has to be reintroduced the function of the master signifiers. One has to take care of, who are his own, who define his honor in a way. But this honor has not to be reduced to the what Gustavo called the ego, the autonomous ego, the one who believes he is alone, the one who believes that his master signifier is only the fact that he's got to this will of jouissance, who reduces himself to that, to the superego of the capitalist discourse. You can have more enjoyment. The plus is needed. Or the way in which each one of us has to take care of his own signifiers is crucial in a way when, if an analyst thinks of himself as an author, like Florenza pointed out, if he thinks of himself as a kind of entrepreneur of his own signifiers, he thinks of himself rather as a poet and not a poem, as Lacan said. Then it will impede him to serve the analytic discourse properly. And that's what's at stake precisely in the nomination of AE in the experience. If one named AE thinks that means he is now qualified as a doctor in psychoanalysis, or qualified as an author in psychoanalysis, wanting to recognize himself as the most consistent of what he has to bring psychoanalysis. That would be the, let's say, the ethical error. The less he thinks of himself as an author, the less he thinks of himself as consistent, the less he thinks of himself as a doctor, the more it will be convenient for addressing the present consequences of the transmission of the analytical knowledge in the world we live in. What Lacan says pleasantly, the disaster the psychoanalytic discourse produces in the world. Perhaps we could say on that?
I think so. I would be very wary of wanting to press the plus of. I thank you, Éric Laurent, for making your, not just for your address, but for making yourself the point of address for our own questions. We have a number of outstanding questions still unasked and unformulated, but we never said that today would give us the final word on all these questions. I think under the conditions, apologizing for those who have questions and comments waiting, that we will thank Éric Laurent for making himself available to us for all the work that he put into the preparation of this text, barely half of which we actually heard delivered which will, I trust, be published in the collection of these texts in due course, and we will all be able to revisit these questions as part of our own work. I thank Éric Laurent for finishing our series on a high note. I thank also Gustavo Dessal for his limpid and very precise intervention, most of all around this notion of the mask as veil. I think there's a whole elaboration to be done around the mask or not the mask, but we'll leave that. We will have time to pursue these questions. I thank also our panelists, made up of the speakers and the discussants who made themselves available so willingly, not just for each of their own interventions, but throughout the whole series of these seminars, to make themselves present in body and on the screen as an animated presence to support the work of speaking and transmission. Most of all, I thank those who joined us today. Apparently, Angelina Harari has joined us from Brazil, current Delegate General of the World Association. We've been fortunate enough to have Michael Besolz in our audience today. We've had each one of you in our audience across the world over these 12 weeks. It's been a fantastic working experience for all of us. We look forward to the opportunity to work with you again on these questions. I thank you all. Thank you very much.